Welcome Algebra 2, this is 4-6, completing the square. The essential question is, when will you use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation? Let's begin. So before we talk about completing the square, I just want to remind you what a perfect square trinomial is. This is a key part to completing the square. So it's a trinomial that is the square of a binomial. So what do I mean by that? This is the trinomial. We have three terms in a trinomial. That's why it's called trinomial. In a binomial, you have two terms. So 3 terms becomes 2 terms squared. So when you factor it. So it's an x plus 5 times an x plus 5. And I can prove that. So I'm going to multiply it using this box here. Go x and plus 5 and x and plus 5. So you multiply the columns and rows and you get x squared and 5x and 5x and 25. So if I added all those up, that'd add up to x squared plus 5 is 10x and plus 25. So that checks out. Multiplying out x plus 5 squared turns back into this trinomial. So the formula for perfect square trinomials are down here. And there's the plus and the minus version. Now, what some of the properties you might want to notice from perfect square trinomials are that the terms in the binomial are the square roots of the x squared and the 25. So what I'm trying to say is the square root of that and the square root of this are our two terms in the binomial. Square root of x squared is x, and square root of 25 is 5. So it's square root of this and that's x and 5. The other thing to notice is that the 10x is 2 times more than the product of the binomial terms. So that means it's 2 times the x and the 5. The x times the 5. That adds up, that multiplies out to 10x. So your middle term of the trinomial with the x is going to be 2 times the product of the binomial's terms. Alright, so let's actually practice that a little bit. Part of doing perfect square trinomial is identifying what numbers you need to do to complete the square. So for this first one, it's 18x here. I know that this 10 is going to be half these terms right here. It's actually just going to be half the number. So it's going to be, in this case, so it's half of that's 9. So and it's 9 squared is going to be inside here, so this is actually going to be 81. For this next one, half of that is negative 10, and negative 10 here is going to be positive 100. Half of negative 2 is going to be negative 1, and negative 1 squared is going to be positive 1. So that's how you complete all of those squares. Over here, I'm just trying to figure out what number goes in the middle. Well, this middle term is going to be the square root of the right. That's going to be 11, and double that, so it'll be 22 right here. This one will be square root of 144, which is 12, and double that will be 24 here. And square root of 1 is going to be 1, and double that will be 2 right here. So that's how you complete the square. Now, sometimes when we're trying to solve an equation, you can just square root both sides to find the solutions. So I have 2 examples right here. I have x squared equals 25. I can square root both sides, and square root of x squared is x. Square root of 25 is either positive or negative 5, because you can negative 5 or positive 5 are solutions. So our solutions are x equals plus or minus 5. Another way to write that is x equals 5 and negative 5. There are going to be 2 solutions here. So expect 2 solutions when you solve these. That's why you have the plus or minus. Now over here in this one, before I square root, I want to isolate the variable as much as possible. So I subtract 10 on each side, and I get 4x squared equals 36. I want to divide by 4 on both sides as well. So these cancel out to get x squared equals 9. Now I'm going to square root both sides, and then you're going to get x equals plus or minus 3. So that's my answer. Positive 3 and negative 3. You might need a factor first before you square root both sides. So this is where the perfect square trinomials come into place. So looking at this one, x squared plus 4x plus 4, this is actually a perfect square trinomial as x plus 2 squared equals 25. And now I can square root both sides. When I square root both sides in this case, on the left, square root something squared, it just cancels out the squared, so you're just left with x plus 2. On the right, square root of 25 is going to be plus or minus 5. So then your answer, we want to isolate the x here. I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides. And so I'm going to get x equals, and don't just go 5 minus 2 and say plus or minus 3. Since you're adding plus 3 or plus 5 or minus 5, we should write this as, I'll write negative 2 right there. X equals negative 2 plus or minus 5. So you can leave it like that, or just do the math. So it'll be x equals negative 2 plus 5 or 3, and negative 2 minus 5 would be negative 7. Either way works to write those answers out. All right, let's do the other one. This trinomial here can be factored to x minus 7 squared because it's going to be half of this number 14, and since there's a minus, it'll be a minus 7 equals 25. I'm going to square root both sides here. What's going to happen when you square root both sides? This is going to turn into x minus 7, and this is going to turn in plus or minus 5. And so what I want to do next is I want to add 7 to both sides. And so I'm going to get x equals 7 plus or minus 5. I can leave it at that, or write this as x equals 12, and 7 minus 5 is 2. There's two ways to write that answer. All right. So we did all that work to actually get into solving by completing the square. And this is just another way to solve a quadratic equation. We learned factoring before. Now we're going to learn completing the square. So the first step, I'm going to have this example here, and please write out these steps. I expect to see this in your notes. So rewrite the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c. So I don't want an equals 0 like this case. I want the c term, just the constant or the number term, to be on the right side, and everything with the variable to be on the left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 15 on both sides of the equation. And when you subtract 15, you get x squared minus 10x, these cancel out, equals negative 15. So now I'm set up in the right form. Step number 2 is complete the square. Just like we did earlier in the video, we have to add something to both sides. So to complete the square here, my square would be like right here, this box. What do I have to add here to turn this into a perfect trinomial? That's going to, since it's negative 10, it's going to be half of that. It's going to be negative 5. It's going to be negative 5 squared, which is going to be 25. So I'm going to add 25 to both sides. What happens when you do that is you're going to get x squared minus 10x plus 25 equals negative 15 plus 25 is going to be positive 10. And that's the next step. So that's completing the square. Now I want to factor the trinomial. So I can factor this on the left-hand side, and that factors to x minus 5 squared equals 10. So already factored. Now I want to solve for x. I want to square root both sides. So square rooting both sides, I'm going to get this square root and square root that. So when I square root, I get x minus 5 on the left equals plus or minus the square root of 10. You can't simplify square root of 10, so just leave it like that. Now the last step, you want to solve for x. So I want to add 5 to both sides. And don't add it with the radical, it's separate here. So these cancel out. I'm left with x equals 5 plus or minus square root of 10. And that's your answer. That's the best form to leave it in. Alright, next one. That's it. Let's try some examples. Pause the video. So what's the solution here? And I want to do this by completing the square. So the first step is you got to get it into the correct format. X squared plus bx equals c. So notice the x squared doesn't have a coefficient, and the number has to be on the right side. So first thing I'm going to do is subtract this number. And so I'm going to get 3x squared minus 12x equals negative 6. But I don't like that 3, so I'm going to divide everything by 3. I wanted to get it just x squared, so divide everything by 3. So what I get when I do that is going to be x squared minus 4x equals negative 2. Now the next step, I have to complete the square. So what's going to go right there to complete the square? Well, negative 4x, half of that's negative 2, and negative 2 squared is going to be 4. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So what I did is I had negative 4, divided it by 2, that equals negative 2. And you want to do negative 2 squared. And that's going to be your perfect square. That's going to complete the square. So what you get is x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals positive 2. Next step is I want to factor. So factoring the left, it's perfect square trinomial. That becomes an x minus 2 squared equals 2. And the next step is I want to get rid of the square root. So I'm going to square, so I'm square root both sides. I'm left with x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. And the very last step, I want to add 2 to both sides. So then I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. And that's your final answer. Alright. Next example, pause the video. Alright, what completes the square? So x squared minus 12x plus something. What's that something going to be in this case? Well, it's half of negative 12. So that's going to be negative 6. Half of negative 12. So divide it by negative 12 divided by 2. That's going to be negative 6. And then you take negative 6 and you square it. And that's going to be 36. So it's going to be 36, and that's my answer. Last example, pause the video. Alright, so the solution to this one. It's just an x squared, there's no x term, so I don't need to use completing the square. I'm going to add 10 to both sides first. When that happens, I get 7x equals 35. And I don't 7x squared. And I don't like that 7, so I divide by 7. And x squared is going to equal 5. And so then the last step, I can square root both sides. And I'm going to get x equals plus or minus the square root of 5. And that's your answer. That's it.